Sonic the Hedgehog, Relaunched Chapter 3, No one can break you, nobody can tear you. Shadow the Hedgehog, that name, Sonic snapped out of his thoughts when he heard Shadow's voice.
Where's the Master Emerald?
Shadow demanded.
Why do you?
Shadow cut him off.
Answer me.
Shadow shouted.
You're not getting it, so why should I?
Shadow cut him off again.
Where's it? I know that you have it.
Shadow shouted. The black hedgehog was punched by someone from behind. Shadow released Sonic. When he fell from the impact, Sonic looked up to see that Knuckles had punched Shadow.
I'll handle this fight. Sonic, go get the Master Emerald.
Knuckles almost shouted before throwing a punch at Shadow. The black hedgehog countered the punch with a kick. Both attacks were barely dodged. Shadow spun at Knuckles. The Echidna grabbed the spinning hedgehog with a single hand. Sonic knew that Knuckles was most likely about to throw Shadow into the ground or something. The blue hedgehog ran for the attic. He entered it and quickly searched around for the Master Emerald. He found it without much difficulty. He held the green gem tightly. He ran out of the attic toward the backyard. He immediately reached it. He glanced around for Tails. His eyes caught something orange.
Tails.
He almost shouted. He ran toward the fox. At least Tails was standing up. The orange fox turned to look at him.
I'm so glad that you're okay, Sonic.
Tails stated, relieved.
I'm so glad that you're okay. You were thrown through a window.
He responded. It was then that he noticed small pieces of glass stuck in Tails' flesh. Tails must have noticed his staring.
I'm just fine. I can pull those out later. For now, we should.
Tails was cut off by Knuckles crashing through the wall and landing hard on the ground.
Knuckles.
Sonic and Tails shouted in unison. The hedgehog and fox ran to the Echidna. Sonic and Tails gasped at what they saw. Knuckles was unconscious.
Oh no!
Tails' voice was barely audible.
How pathetic.
Sonic knew who had spoken. He and Tails turned around. Shadow emerged from the hole in the wall. Shadow's red eyes seemed to glow terrifyingly. The blue hedgehog handed Tails the Master Emerald.
Get out of here.
He whispered.
Sonic, I can't just...
He cut Tails off.
I have to fight him. I don't want you to get hurt, so get out of here.
He had concern in his voice. Tails nodded. The fox first ran over to Knuckles, grabbed him, and then began to run off. After making sure that Tails was leaving, Sonic turned back to Shadow.
You may have been able to counter my spin, but you will never be able to counter my full power.
He moved his right hand toward his left wrist. He felt for the large gold ring and unclasped it, causing it to fall to the ground. Shadow took notice of the large ring. Shadow's gaze had slowly fallen to look at the golden large ring. The blue hedgehog moved his left hand toward his right wrist to unclasp his other large ring. He felt for it, then unclasped it. The second large ring fell to the ground. He slowly knelt down to reach the large gold rings on his ankles.
I see what you're thinking. You think you're the only hedgehog with that kind of power, don't you?
Shadow asked. He ignored the black hedgehog as he unclasped the large gold ring on his left ankle.
At least this will be a somewhat fair fight.
He once again ignored Shadow's comment. His ears perked. When he heard the familiar sound of the large ring unclasping, he quickly looked up at Shadow. The black hedgehog had unclasped his right large gold ring on his wrist and was currently reaching for his left gold ring on his wrist. He had noticed Shadow's rings before, but it couldn't have been true. Shadow couldn't have had the same exact power, right? He shifted his focus once again to his right ankle. He unclasped his last large gold ring. He stood back up. He began to glow with electricity radiating off of him as soon as that last ring was unclasped. He didn't need a mirror to know that his eyes had turned blue. Shadow unclasped his last large gold ring as well. Sonic gasped, absolutely shocked. As soon as Shadow unclasped his last large ring, he began to glow in the same exact way that Sonic himself was glowing. Shadow also had electricity radiating off of him, and his eyes had somehow changed their shade of red. Or maybe they just gained little electricity bolts. Either way, Shadow had the exact same power that Sonic had. Shadow slowly stood up. Before he could say anything, Shadow began to charge at him. He charged at Shadow. The two of them slammed into each other. They were both flung backward from the impact. He attempted to spin at Shadow again. Shadow did the same thing. They constantly slammed into each other while curled up into a ball. Sonic uncurled himself. Shadow did the same. Sonic began to run around Shadow as fast as he could. Shadow began to do the exact same thing. They ran around each other until they slammed into each other at high speeds. They both hit the ground.
But how?
Sonic asked. As he stood back up, Shadow stood back up as well.
I know every one of your attack moves precisely.
Shadow replied. Sonic knew what he had to do. It wouldn't take much effort.
Chaos! Control!
Shadow shouted. At the exact same moment that Sonic attempted to slow down time, time slowed, but it wasn't super obvious. They were both still moving at the same pace.
You didn't know what that ability is called, did you? The one where you slow down time around you, it's called Chaos Control. You always did know how to do it with just a thought. But I don't know if you ever learned this one. Chaos Spear.
Shadow shouted. Shadow threw some kind of red energy at Sonic. He tried to dodge it, but the energy honed in on him and struck him. Time resumed to its normal speed. Sonic was laying on the ground face first. He slowly looked up. Shadow approached him. The black hedgehog suddenly fainted forward right in front of him.
Sonic, what happened then?
It was Tails' voice. The fox flew over to him, followed by Knuckles.
I thought I told you to leave.
He stated.
Tails decided to stay and watch you. After I woke up, I wanted to help you in the fight, but Tails didn't want me to.
Knuckles explained. Blue electricity began to spark on Sonic's large gold rings. The same thing happened to Shadow's large rings, except it was red electricity. Sonic's large rings returned to his wrists and ankles. The rings clasped themselves back onto Sonic's limbs. The same thing happened to Shadow, except the rings weren't hidden.
We need to get out of here.
Tails suggested. He nodded. Tails grabbed him and began to fly off. Knuckles followed them. Shadow forced himself upward a little bit, enough to look up.
Sonic!
Shadow fell back down, unconscious.